programs at Milano School of Management and at the New School. And some of you who are repeat attendees know that this was meant to be a conference in May, and unfortunately, due to the events related to COVID-19, we had to re-envision the conference into a year-long conversation. And as I've said previously, that this is particularly, very selfishly very appealing to me because I am able to attend all the programs. Unlike in the 2 days, I may not have been able to do that. And today I have my, it's a great pleasure to invite Debbie Rundlet and Nita Howard from the Poets and the Prophets. And this is particularly interesting to me because as someone that is actually completely non-religious and atheistic, I have always been very deeply, though, attracted to understanding and exploring the role of spirituality in people's lives. And as someone that has been studying social movements and social movement leaders, I actually wrote a paper a long time ago about the reclaiming the sacred as a source of generative capacities in post-colonial communities. And so, so one of the questions here is that in social justice movements, there have been two kind of directions. One is the Marxist structuralist approaches, which is more about strategies and resources approach and the framing, but external material resources. But then a lot of the movement leaders, whether it was Dr. King to Mahatma Gandhi to Mandela to the people that I have studied who are more localized environmental leaders and community leaders, have always talked about the very critical role of spirituality in their life, whether it is their relationship with the earth, which they think of it as sacred if they're environmentalists, and then whether it is their relationship with their community that they think of as inviolable and sacred, or whether it is even the sacred ideals of democracy and liberty and equality and justice. And earlier I was just talking to the panelists about how vital this particular topic is in today's context, especially because it sometimes looks very hopeless, right? Everything is so, there are so many things that are going on that is so beyond our control, or at least seemingly beyond our control, especially in the shorter time frame, that we don't have like a magic wand that I can wave and solve problems that are so huge. And that's not very different historically from several things that do take, anything that's worth doing sometimes takes a long time, and it's a kind of a long walk towards that. And so for that, we really do need the resilience and the inner resources that sustain us to get to the other end with optimism and hope. And I think in that context, not in a religious context, at least personally for me, but from that context of engaging the human spirit, this is a very important topic. And this is something that, so relevant and so particular. So I'm very excited, like the rest of you, to participate in this and learn about this approach and, be engaged. And they have designed a exciting, engaging kind of an exercise to demonstrate how to do this. So thank you very much for joining us. And thank you, Debbie and Anita, for doing this for us. I'm super excited to let you take the stage and participate.
Thank you, Latha. It is such a privilege to be here, and we have been so looking forward to it. This is work that Anita and I have been engaged with now for 8 years in a variety of forms. So there have been multiple iterations, and we've looked at it through a number of different lenses. And so we're just so glad you're here. For me personally, the intersection of this work comes with the spiritual formation of the leader and change leadership. And there is no way that will happen without the care of the inner resources, as Latha has just named. And so we're going to take you on a bit of a journey today. We promise to honor the time commitment that we have made to one another, and Anita will be sharing more about her journey and her work later as we live into this experience together. But for a moment, I want to just pause. And I want to ask you all just to jot down or capture in your mind, why are you here? And I'm going to ask you not to go to the easy answer, well, I'm here because of Debbie and Anita, or I'm here, yes, I see you laughing, Alan, because, you know, it was just something to do at noon today, Eastern Standard Time. What brought you into this moment? If you could just name for yourself, what drew you? And now I'm going to share a bit of why I am here. I do want to say that this session is being recorded really for our study and use. So please be at peace. We will not share your face or your words, certainly without your permission. But we did want you to be aware of that. Poets and Prophets has emerged out of several convictions that I have carried within my heart, and been blessed to have Anita wrestle with me. The first is that the whole leader requires the whole person. As leaders, we are extraordinarily attentive to our mental acumen. We study, we stretch, we grow. We've also been responsible about our emotional health, and we've attended to that. And the majority of us are committed to our physical health. But we haven't quite known what to do about our spiritual health. And I think that that is because we have gotten into this convoluted place where we automatically associate our spiritual formation with religious institutions. And in this season especially, that can lead us into a deeply conflicted place. The other thing I want to say, and we'll get into this a little bit, I believe that the 21st century leader, it will be a mystic or not at all. Paul Ricoeur has said that human behaviors cannot be changed through moral imperative alone, but through a transformed imagination. And with that, we live into this place of non-duality, in which we stop labeling things as good or bad, and instead live in the inherent tension of the fact that there are times in which we are going to need to make choices that carry a moral imperative and yet are going to take us on a prophetic journey. And within that, we need to be attentive to this movement between reflection and action and the engagement of practices that will help us to grow up into spiritual maturity. I also want to say that the application of what we're talking about moves from a complexity perspective across the levels of self and team, organization, community, and beyond. So Poets and Prophets begins as an interpretive lens, an intuition of how to look at the world. And out of that interpretive lens that draws from multiple theories, it calls us into a place where we might engage core practices, the practice of the poetic voice and the prophetic voice, which from a non-dual perspective are not separate things. Through the years, I've had different individuals go, oh, well, I'm the poet, and oh, and you're the prophet. And that's not the case at all. If you think about it, they're opposite sides of the same coin. And they engage us in both the inner and the outer journey. Now, for today's purposes, you're not in a doctoral class. We are going to actually just simply focus on the formational set and the mystical path. because the mystical path is identical across every major religious tradition and also non-religious traditions. And it reflects some of where I believe we're stuck as a society. So I'm going to just move us over to that place. That said, I want you to note that in this developmental lens, it does speak to core needs. It draws deeply from the archetypes of Jung. There is a metaphorical lens for those of you in management practice. Gareth Morgan's work coming out of the University of Toronto has been very impactful for me. And Janet Hagberg's work in terms of how we engage power, because we all engage power, has also, excuse me, spoken into the development of poets and prophets. The other thing is I put this together for you all in a chart, but there is nothing linear about it. It is more akin to walking a labyrinth where just as you think you're getting into the center, you're being pulled out. Or perhaps, and it's not by mistake, that the logo for Poets and Prophets is a nautilus, because it carries us through and we cycle through these aspects of journey multiple times in the course of our leadership. So let's take a quick look at the mystical path. This was named by Evelyn Underhill, and she talks about the importance of awakening, of awareness, and how are we engaging our world. This lens of awakening typically sees the ideal in our world. And Anita will be speaking some about how this might tie or be informed by intentional change. But as with every awakening, we come to that place where we begin to see the shadow side, where we are going to be tested and tried. And that, if we are attentive and stay with it, breaks through to a new level of illumination. But here's the challenge. That's not the end of the journey. However, I think we live in a world of leadership where many people do see it as the end of the journey. After all, we've gone through this wonderful awakening, we've been tested, and now we have this illumination of what we should be doing. But if we stop there, we are not moving into that place of non-duality. And so again and again, we hit the wall. And with the wall, we have choice points to make. There's a letting go that needs to happen in order to take hold. And as with all change, there is loss. And of course, the other thing that we intuit is with that letting go will come a dark night of the soul. But it is out of that dark night that the essence of our call as leaders emerges. And it tips us into what Richard Rohr and others have called the second half of life, that place of deepening maturity as a leader. With that call, we find that intersection of our passions and our strengths in response to the needs of the world and the planet. This is that reinterpretation of a triple bottom line, if you will, in which we're looking at the needs of people and of planet, and how then do we flourish together in terms of prosperity. Even then, through the dark night, that's when we finally come to that unitive place where we're no longer thinking in either or terms, in good, bad terms. And that finally tips us into that place of non-duality. Put in a formational set in terms of our own spiritual formation, that involves 5 aspects, although there are other C's, as you saw. What is not immediately identified in these C's is conflict or culture or context. But let's begin with what we do have. If we do not begin with core identity and we do not have a clarity of who we are, we will constantly be in tension of trying to trade out self, to use language of systems, in order to fit into the context in which we find ourselves. And so it becomes important for us to connect with source that we might claim the fullness of who we are. And out of that, are readied for that character refinement that comes through testing and discerning. It's then that we step into community in our leadership for the flourishing of all. Even then, though, there's more refinement of call and our understanding of leadership, not just to the performance of the job we do, but to engagement and action that carries us into care of not only our teams and the organization, but the communities of which we serve. I will never forget being on a team where we had been brought in to do an appreciative inquiry process. And in that, we did not know the particulars of the work until we arrived. And what they wanted was something that was not appreciative at all. To move basically the financial base to Belgium to avoid taxes. And when we pressed the question of community and the impact for this multinational and what that might mean, it raised questions that they hadn't even thought of because they were in such tunnel vision. But ultimately, that call to engagement and action looks at the much broader, deeper implications of our work. And it's then that we can tap in to the many different competencies that we bring and the gifts that we have. And we find ourselves not just individually, but within our teams and organizations fully alive. The mystic Howard Thurman has said, don't ask what the world needs, but ask what makes you alive and go do it. Because what the world needs is you fully alive. But of course, this is not just simply an individual journey. This is a collective journey. And in this journey, we bear responsibility both for self and for the other. There is a profound word that encompasses, I think, the tensions of the time in which we find ourselves, and it's xenos. And you know the root of the word, xenos, finds its way into xenophilia, love of all things, and xenophobia, fear of the stranger. At its root, this word actually translates alternatively as guest and host and stranger. What would it mean in terms of our attentiveness to actually be able to engage with the stranger that lies within ourselves? It might actually then open us to be able to welcome the stranger in our midst. Be that stranger the person on the team who always thinks differently, or the person in our community who brings a different culture that will bless us if we can engage in that. And understand that in that fullness of engagement, we're not being asked to trade out self, but we are being asked to embrace the diversity of it all. So I want to speak a little bit about the leader as poet and prophet, and I want to give us some working definitions for that. Remember, this is not an either-or engagement. Indeed, if you engage as the poet alone, you are likely not to accomplish very much. And if you engage as the prophet alone, you are likely to alienate just about everyone. But if you can manage to live in the tension of the two, then you begin to engage yourself and others in a way that brings us to that wonderful gift of transformed imagination. So the poet helps us to remember who we are. Honestly, I'm not sure that we do remember who we are as humanity, called in this very interdependent way to care for one another across all levels and to care for our environment and planet. And so the poet helps us to remember, and through image and story, shapes meaning out of the chaos of this time, weaving together disparate, often dissonant voices into this rich tapestry of meaning. And this is really important. When we are true to the poet within us, we neither reduce nor eliminate the creative tensions, but instead we dare to dwell in them until they begin to reveal for us the future that is seeking to emerge. And this then becomes the means by which a new collective consciousness can speak into our present moment. But again, if left alone, the poet is not going to move us to the level of action that is needful for transformation to occur. And so the prophet is the one who empowers the community to reside in the liminality of our time. And instead of avoiding or minimizing our differences, it's claiming the gift of conflict. Yet how many of our conflictual situations are answered by either looking away and not engaging, or by becoming so toxic that it becomes a place where nothing can be accomplished. But when we press beyond the individualization of our times, it's then we come to not only realize, but honor our interdependence. So the prophetic challenge then is to cross over into a new understanding of role and responsibility, to be not just the job description we each carry, not just the profit and bottom line, if you will, of the places in which we work, but that collective responsibility toward the flourishing of people and planet. And none of this can be accomplished without being attentive to the formational journey. The journey in which we wake up and grow up, in which we are as attentive to our need for spiritual maturity as we are for our mental acumen, as we are for emotional health and physical fitness. So I am going to pause, and before I tip us into an exercise, I'm going to see if there are any questions. And by way of preparing for that, I'm going to ask you to just take a moment and capture what spoke to you. What engaged your curiosity? And then if you have a question, I would invite you just to unmute yourself and introduce yourself and ask. All right. Then I'm going to tip us into an exercise that some of you may have encountered before. Indeed, this has been a movement across the United States. A poet by the name of George Ella Lyon wrote a poem, Where I'm From. This poem's now used in prison systems, it's used in elementary schools, and it is used in executive education. Her poem begins with the most incredible images that capture a sense of place and belonging. I am from clothespins, from Clorox and carbon tetrachloride. I am from dirt under the back porch, black, glistening. It tasted like beets. I'm going to invite you now to actually take some time to reflect on your own roots. We're going to give you about 5 minutes or so, 10 minutes, to write your poem. And in it, we invite you to ponder the places and people and experiences that have shaped your journey. Some questions you might want to ask yourself is, how does where you're from inform who you are? Is there anything that needs releasing in order to become the person that you're called to be in this time and place? And how does your past inform your emergent future? And then what we're going to do, after you have a chance just to capture some thoughts, we're not looking for a finished poem, although you'll be amazed at what can happen in 10 minutes. We're then going to put you into a breakout group with a partner. And we're going to ask you both to share with one another for about 3 to 5 minutes. And then we'll come back together to reflect with one another. So I have 12:26, and at 12:35, I will give you warning that you're going into a breakout group. Where are you from? And how does the poet within you speak to the time of your present call?
Debbie, is it now seen?
It is seen.
Okay.
You might make it a little bigger, but I can see it.
It's gonna pop off if I do it any bigger because I'm into the PowerPoint without it being in presentation mode. But I just wanna say first that I am excited to be here talking in this amazing conversation and with people who are really interested in understanding poets, prophets, social action comes in, where how do we move poet and prophet energies that we each have, where Debbie and I have sort of conceptualized at the action level, poets and prophets being the step of the poet is out of your own roots, your history, who you are, what you value, what you care about, what moves you, in the spirit of what Dr. Poonamallee was talking about, the human spirit sense of what moves you. How do you catch that and communicate that, articulate it, when, especially around the social action aspect, we're thinking about addressing the pressing needs and hopes that are born out of the crises and the challenges of the moment, and the prophetic voice that we each bring and share and can create is giving a vision of how we're going to move forward. So if we look at the action step and social action aspect of poets and prophets, it's about moving again in a way that is authentic, is mindful, is spirit-led in the sense of knowing who you are and where you come from, and how that again can get shared and communicated at the social action shared level. And we can then come together to create a picture of how to move forward to address things, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. I want to say again, my background, and I come to Poets and Prophets out of a civil rights movement background, where I grew up in a family of activist teachers. My father was a minister. He headed these, during the time I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, he was with Martin Luther King's organization and headed the SCLC, Christian Leadership Conference for Washington, D.C. But the point is that in that mix of people I grew up around and in, there were all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of stories who were very interested in and moving in a spirit-led way to address the problems of the times. And again, though it started with, in many people's and many of the foci there in the civil rights movement, were looking at African-American and Black issues and problems and challenges. It was within the context of that larger humanitarian effort. It's also why I am so moved by being here in the Milano's social justice and management conversation, because it was part of the whole idea of action theory link, the movement between what you understand and appreciate and know in a poetic sense, in the analytic understanding, study history, and act on what we know, and the standing on the shoulders of giants sense. These folks really believed in connecting to who we are individually and collectively, and really critically thinking about that in historical sense, in scholarship sense, and out of that, informing action that made what people were doing rest on knowledge that was actionable. And so I grew up all the time hearing about the New School, all the time connected to people who were doing presentations and talking about the New School, people in my neighborhood, people who were in my parents' generation who were doing that. It was just organic, because the New School was a place, and you go back to the history of the New School, they talk about when folks are founding it in 1919, that it was a place that they envisioned in the prophetic sense to be a context where citizens, ordinary citizens, all of us could come to engage in open discussion about what the issues of the times were, what the challenges of the times were, in order, and here you see that social action move, to solve social problems, plural. And there were all kinds of problems going on. If you clock to today, you see the picture on there on what I would think is the left there, is today even, the New School has a collaboratory, which they call coming together with community and New School folks from all levels of the organization to support scholar activists, people who are grounded in that understanding of history, critically thinking and reflecting about it. And how does that then inform in the poetical grasp what we're going to do to move forward? And they're talking about that as scholar activists. So the New School was there in my growing up period, shaping a space and a community of folks coming together to talk about these kind of things. And I'm kind of going back to that relevant past to sort of move forward into sort of focusing us on what do we mean by social action when we connect that to poets and prophets. So I'm going to take a minute just to define social action. Here's the online dictionary is saying it's individual or group behavior that involves interaction. You're relating, you're connecting, you're working with others on some level, other individuals, other groups, and especially organized towards action in the spirit of social reform. So that's just a generic understanding that we have in the popular sense of things. And what you see here is we're moving from that roots that's grounded sense, wherever and whoever I am and where I'm from, to a collective now social action engagement. Cummings and Bridgman are people who wrote in 2011 about Max Weber. And they were returning to sort of look at these management scholars, the importance of understanding and revisiting our history so we might understand and reinterpret it to understand present and future. And sometimes they're arguing that the management got wrong about Weber, and they went back for him to calling us to really understand how we're going to engage with history, poet, to move to a vision of the future. Profit and management is that an organizational behavior. He hugely influenced Max Weber. So I'm coming for his early 20th century understanding of social action. And Weber, as much as he struggled with bureaucracy and the iron cage, he was really interested in spirituality and how do people kind of move out of the structures that we're in to re-envision together at a social action level where we're going in the future. He defines in that spirit and wrote a lot about how social action is action meaningfully oriented toward others. And I want to, for our purposes today, sort of rest in those definitions. We also have in the early 20th century, Josiah Royce, who is bringing another very seminal idea. He's the one who is credited with coining the word, the beloved community. If we're doing social action, it's interactive, it's relational, it's with other individuals and people, this notion of beloved community coming out of a spiritual understanding, a philosophical take. Where philosophical is how do we see and understand life at its best, driven by our values. He coins the word, the beloved community, the concept of beloved community, and basically talks about it as not just a skill, but an art and an applied art, which is going to win all over to unity, a kind of collective, beloved interconnectedness, which shall overcome their original hatefulness by gracious love, not of mere individuality, but of community. So there are a lot of tensions he's alluding to here in terms of how we are in community with each other, even in the early 1900s when these concepts are being discussed, shared, and coined. He, by the way, was one of the founding members of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which still today is out there in the world working, and which hugely, as well as the communities like New School, which were bringing people together to talk and think about these things, go back in history to go forward in the future. But this notion of action and social action being also coterminously in the early 1900s being formed around for many people, this notion of beloved community. When we go next, we see this idea being reinvented. I'm having trouble getting to my next slide. By Martin King, people like Howard Thurman. Here's Martin, who was talking about it and rethought this, as many people did, because these folks who were activists, as we move now to the middle 20th century, were studying and were scholar activists who were reading anybody and everybody who was wrestling with these key issues of the challenges of the times. And Martin King and others, influenced again by Thurman and by Josiah's take on the beloved community, builds it into a new and broader concept of a community of caring where poverty, hunger, and injustice are no more. So this notion of beloved community is inclusive. It is understanding in that activist sense, and as Martin King really talked about, wherever there is injustice, poverty, or hunger, we need to be concerned about it. So we're, again, reaching for that understanding of social action in an interest to be addressing and including everybody in our interest for sort of improvement of options and life. We come through to, again, and I appreciate, stay with me here. I don't know what's happening. We next have John Lewis, who is a part of that times, was the younger to Martin King and others who were older, who we see passed last week, calling us to another sort of aspect of understanding beloved community, where we're asking the question of what is actionable and being personally responsible and collectively responsible for engaging that beloved community and to do it in the moment. We also have another thinker who is still with us. He's 93 now, Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a Buddhist monk and a peace activist and someone who's deeply into the mindfulness tradition. So again, just understanding social action, this notion that the larger our community of interest and connection is extremely important in terms of engaging that beloved community. Today, I'm bringing us Brittany Packnett Cunningham, who is herself an activist. She is also now, she's Project Zero co-founder, and she represents the many ways in which the beloved community notion is now open and dynamic and intersectoral and has citizens of all sorts, not with this top-down leadership sense, even our history that casts people like Martin Luther King and John Lewis as having led the movement are not accurate. The movement was being led and engaged by many, many people. They were poetically and prophetically catching what was going on and living their lives forward in engaged action and putting their lives on the line for that and inviting us all to figure out and be interested in how do we contribute to that beloved community, again, coming from our own roots, but engaging in social and collective action. So you see Brittany Packard Cunningham talking now about the numbers of us, all of us who have that same scholar activist capacity, intellect, creativity, and that for her leadership and leadership of a communitarian approach in today's world means that we actually begin to figure out how we're working together to make sure that the needs of all of us are addressed in a really sufficient, and I love the way she's saying that, sufficient to the task, to really be impactful, to have structural change moving is where people have gone today in understanding the ordinary citizen's capacity and invitation to really get into social action. It's intersectoral. Okay, she's telling us. So those people sort of bring us to the moment of, and I'm not here picturing all of the issues of the times, but just asking you to think of all the very many different issues that need to be basically addressed and enjoined for those of us who are understanding where the challenges and the tensions sit. And out of that, what might we see as a vision of moving forward if we were indeed addressing that in the interest of sustaining and holding a beloved community, intersectoral, concern about all of us, actually structurally doing things that are going to ensure and hold all of us in a more positive aspect. What we have now also is COVID-19, which has intensified our understanding of the fact that even though that person is on the other side of the city, on the other side of the world, in a different identity group than I am, we are connected in a way that is being deeply appreciated today because the interconnectedness is unavoidably seen as we all see how our choices about whether we're even wearing a mask is affecting that person and persons that we're interacting with in other ways, and that's moving in a complexity-driven way back and forward. So the issues are huge. Poverty, 1 billion people this COVID-19 could push 500 million people into poverty, and the staggering impact on education. We're seeing this play out daily. And even how are we getting our groceries, caring for the frontline people and so forth. A lot of leadership issues here. And there's a way, if we're understanding the intersectionality of it all and the beloved community calling, there's a way in which we all are invested in some way contributing our leadership. So defining social action for purposes today of looking at poetical and prophetical engagement and social action and the connections between those things are giving us that mosaic of community where we all are coming from communities of origins, our roots, and that's shaping us in profound ways that we need to understand. And always spiritual thought tells us be in tune and in touch with that in an authentic, mindful, and holistic kind of way. We're also embedded where we sit right now, our schools, our current life stage, our current context of family, friends, workplaces, activities that shape us and our way of understanding our community. We, each of us, under our own skins, are belonging to multiple identities. We all hold multiple identities: racial, ethnic identity, we have a class identity, age and ability, religion, sexual, gender, and spatial. Where is our neighborhood, our region, our nationality? How are we situated? So that those are part of the whole mosaic of community that you bring. And we are also arguing, those of us who are understanding the spiritual approach, there is that beloved community that is equally important to us as a whole part of the mosaic to which we belong. So that's how we're defining social action for purposes of looking at it, poets and prophets, from a management perspective. And I'm now going to bring 3 traditions of scholarship within the context of management that kind of, I think, and Debbie and I have long talked about, really are essential to being able to move into social action where it's interacting with other individuals and groups to move that holism around the mosaic of community to which you belong, but having an impact at the end and the beginning of the day and concern about everybody, inclusively and intersectorally. These three are relational leadership, collective leadership, and intentional change leadership. It is how we need, I think, to think about and can draw on management traditions to look at how we can think about leadership moving forward. Relational leadership is an idea coming from Comavez, Lucas, and McMahon, who are folks coming out of the leadership tradition, looking at all of them, teaching and helping young people, college people, to understand how to go back in the history of how do we look at leadership and understand it and reinvent it. They've come with a new model that is very, is where I think a lot of the leadership work is going for many reasons, but they're basically positing that relational leadership is an ethical process of people coming together to attempt to move positive change. There are a number of additions to this definition of leadership that are important. It's not top down, it's relational, it's engaged. Everybody is in some kind of way able to contribute leadership to the mix. It's ethical and it's focused on positive engagement and movement and change. There are many, many, many definitions of leadership, and they come from all kinds of different angles, but their definition has introduced in this 21st century understanding and late 20th century that it's a process. It's not a dynamic one characteristic or several characteristics that one or several people hold. It's a process that engages all of us, which means that the key pieces of it is that it's focused on some intent and purpose. When we are leading and we're doing it relationally, we're about doing something. It's purposive, it's inclusive, everybody is involved in some kind of way and in bringing different forms of leadership to the mix, and we're trying to understand and engage that. It's empowering people to do that, and most important, it's ethical in the sense that it is humanistic, caring, and not harming other people. So this is a definition of leadership that I want to suggest coming out of management is extremely important as it moves to what we were talking about with early on in the early 1900s. Weber and all these other thinkers, beloved community, are talking about that interconnectedness and the ethics of it all, such that we're pulling a process that all of us are benefiting from. Also, we have Joseph Raylan, who is coming from Northeastern, who has done a lot of work in leadership and most recently has come in with talking and defining collective leadership as the way we need to move forward. He talks about how this is scary for people because this notion that everybody is involved, everybody is serving and can lead and can do that coterminously, sort of like what you're seeing in the explosion of activity since George Floyd's death. People moving to the streets, moving to their organizations, moving to intersectoral conversations and change. Everybody trying to figure out how they can share and understand and sort of invent prophetically a future together out of what it is each person brings. Collective leadership there is involving everyone and assuming everybody can contribute and participate in that. It's concurrent at the same time. Everyone can speak. It is profoundly dispersive. And as he describes it, people can be concerned about that because our 20th century models of leadership were not understanding that. They were more top-down, leaders more in control, the leader is more moving others, people are following. This is a very big shift in your visceral understanding of what leadership is. The other one is, and this is important because you see echoes here of that beloved community understanding, everyone commits to preserving the dignity of each and every member. And this is very interesting, regardless of background, regardless of social status, and regardless of point of view. So even if you're dealing with people who viscerally and deeply disagree with you and might be bringing things you consider to be dangerous or threatening ideas, you still see them as being part of the collective leadership picture to which you're connected in a sense, or including them as well in the beloved community. It gets to be quite a tension and a stretch, but it's, I think, an important thing as we move forward in a very much deeper, more tightly networked world. Intentional change is a model that's coming through many people who out of Case and other places, Case Western where I am, Reserve University, and Richard Boyasis is mainly situated. He is a researcher that has been looking at long and studying long emotional and social intelligence as well as change process. And he looks at it at the individual, and we look at it as well in the complexity sense, what's happening at the team, organization, and group level. But the understanding, and I'm giving you the group level model because right now we're interested in social action and social change and working together at that level of complexity. He's basically saying it's a continuing and ongoing process. Again, we're never at some endpoint where we've got it fixed, we've got the change, it's done, it's fixed, it's over. Life is dynamic, it's complex, it's ever ongoing. So people are constantly having to come together and build a shared vision, the profit, based on what they poetically have captured as the challenge or the intent to figure out where they're going to go in the future. They bring both strengths and weaknesses to that. So we all are in a situation where we're being able to mindfully look at and critically think about what do I bring, what do I not bring, how the other can cover what I cannot bring. And we create an understanding of what we have by way of resourcing such that we can get an actionable plan going. All right, that's again moving us at the collective level. And then the intentional change theory moves us through to taking now some action, practicing and trying out, experimenting, moving the design that we've come up with in this collective way. And then going back to, as we sort of move those things into action and into manifest experience, looking at that, revisioning that, re-understanding that, and coming back for where are we now and as we move forward. It's a continual, iterative, ongoing process, which this theory and approach suggests that we need to understand as the way leadership dynamically happens. All of this is being constantly supported by social capital. Those are those relationships that are resonant, that hold it all together, where resonance is that we're moving in a way that is collective and pro-social, proactive, moving that beloved community in some kind of way. So my final thought here is that those are three management perspectives. There are many more, there are many other theories, but at a very core sense of it, we need to be understanding we're in relationship with each other always at the social action level. We are doing this in a way that is collective leadership and moving to increasing our capacity to engage collective leadership that's moving in a more dynamic way perhaps than the top-down 20th century understanding of it is, and also doing that in a way that's intentionally, choicefully, mindfully working in a collective way to pave that way forward. Poets, again, articulate those pressing hopes and needs born of present crisis. Prophets create that shared vision and do that in the ways that these different leadership approaches allow and support. And poets and prophets nurture that beloved community, and they take action. They're taking social action. They're moving it together. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Debbie. Debbie, you need to unmute.
Yes, I do. Thanks, Anita. So let's go ahead and take down the screen because we have an opportunity to visit with one another. And what I'd like to ask you to do, that was a lot of information, profound information. So I want to give you a chance for a quick capture, just 30 seconds worth, to take some notes and reflect on what you heard. Now, just take another 10 seconds or so, and we'll come back together. So when I first encountered Anita and Richard Boyatzis' work and others on intentional change theory, one of the things that I was most struck by is how directly it paralleled the mystical path and the formational journey. That in fact, it gave language for how to engage, not just simply at the level of self, not just simply on the interior inward journey, but for that movement outward into community. I'm curious, and I see in the chat some really wonderful conversations starting, and we've got about 10 minutes before we pass the baton back to Latha. To hear your thoughts about where do you see points of engagement in terms of that intersection of the spiritual formation of the leader with collective leadership, with that movement out into the beloved community and our care for people and planet. And then Anita, Yanis has a great question. How do you create unifying purpose out of conflicting identities?
Do you want me to address that now? Okay. One of the things that we see coming out of the civil rights movement is there is deep lessons there in that. It's deeply discursive, it's deeply time consuming, and it means that people have to be able to come to the collective space, the discussion of things, the disagreements, the tensions, with a real ability to hear the other. This is where it takes emotional and social intelligence to get what I'm hearing from you that I deeply disagree with, hold my own understanding and truth, but in a spirit of getting to the place where we talk it through until till we resolve it, and don't let go until we do, because we both and all of us who are in that conversation have the intent to move collective leadership, because we understand that's the only way we're going to hold the community that in a way that is going to be sustainable for all of us. So what this meant was, if you look at it from the examples of the movement, is we often had conversations that started with a real tough problem where there was deep disagreement about, and would start at 7 o'clock in the evening in a meeting with 34, 35 people trying to discuss and move through, who disagreed with each other. Everybody had to speak collective leadership. Everybody had to listen to and do perspective taking about what the other said. And everybody had to stay there till we got out the other end with a solution. It is a very different kind of engagement than what we typically do in leading and following and engaging in many organizations and contexts, families, and settings that we're in right now. But it is doable. This is what folks did in the civil rights movement, which is why so many people at John Lewis's funeral last Thursday, one of the people who was supporting the freedom riders to go into the freedom rides in the South, and of course, you know that John Lewis is one of those early freedom riders, was talking about how the history books have got it wrong because it was profoundly discursive, and nobody was going in understanding exactly what we were going to do and knowing exactly the right way out. But what people were willing to do was to get into these tough, difficult conversations and do it in a way that respected each other as well as challenged each other to really listen to each other and sort it out. This is why the scholarship is important, because what the core values, what the core principles, the study, the critical thinking it takes to do this is what we all are not often having to roll up our sleeves and doing. We let the leaders do it, the people at the top do it, it distributes downward and so forth and so on. So when Raylan, who's from the management tradition, is talking about collective leadership, he's talking about a big move that really puts a different kind of responsibility of participatory leadership and involvement on all of us. But it's possible, and people have done it, and we can do it. Is it easy? No. Does it take time? Yes. Does it take a real challenge in actually respecting the person who's differing from you? Being able to give up your capacity to be in sole control over even your own destiny. It's a collective process and so forth. I'll stop there.
And so I would add to what Anita said, one of the pieces that we've tried to provide with Poets and Prophets are a series of practices. And one of the practices is on separating out our levels of listening. So often we listen in order to respond and to create opportunities to listen from the mind, from the heart, from the gut, and then how do we integrate those levels of listening? And that tips me in then to another question related to followership, which of course takes me to Barbara Kellerman's work out of Harvard. And if we are engaged and committed to growing up into spiritual maturity, we're going to understand, as Anita just said, there are times to lead and there are times to follow. And to understand when those baton passes happen, when we need that time apart to dwell, when we need to be engaged in life together and life apart. And my conviction with regard to followership is how then are we growing up and waking up in maturity, spiritual maturity, professional maturity, that we understand, and this is a place of wrestling, where we need to be in community with others, where we do not have the answer, and in fact would do better to actually shape the question, because we live in the direction of the questions we ask. And there again, when we work with the poetic voice, it helps us in framing the question. Indeed, sometimes just the practice of asking, what is the question, takes us to a place we couldn't have imagined. And that can in turn tip us into that prophetic voice, which gives us clarity as to who needs to be engaged. Where is this moving us toward? But Anita may have some distinctive thoughts with regard to followership.
You know, again, if you look at the relational leadership work and people who are moving in that direction, collective leadership, they're reinventing followership as something that is a different kind of leading and relationally connecting. And so there's much thought on this. These things are not to be understood as they're ideas, they're dynamic ideas. We engage them, we test them, we try them in that intentional change sense. But even if you just look at the kinds of things that people are saying in the chat, the shift to asking and looking at it in different ways begins to bring up all kinds of different ideas and conversations and ways of approaching this that literally can inform how we're relating to each other and co-creating things. The followership is co-creational in these relational leadership models. So if I'm following, I'm doing it not in that, again, in a one down, go track behind you sense. I'm doing it in this kind of sense, and I'm contributing something. It's dynamic. I'm thinking about what it is I contribute. How do I fit into this? How do we fit together? And we're co-creating in that sense. So a lot of our language of thinking about leadership doesn't track to that all the time and easily. It's just taking work. It's going to take work and effort, but it's the willingness to put in that effort and work and deal with the unease of it all. I think it's the beginning to be, someone said maturity, in the chat. How do you hold the kind of patience and flexibility, resilience and capacity? That's why we come back to the roots to go forward to the critical thinking, and it's a constant process and cycle, and you're never, ever done with it. right? It's ongoing in that sense.
Absolutely. Any last thoughts or questions before we ask Latha to give us a sense of what is coming as we live forward in terms of the work that they're doing at the new school? Well, we thank you because, you know, there's nothing like the gift of being able to put together your thoughts and then engage with others. And you help us to refine them, to think of things that we hadn't thought of. So thank you very much. I also want to say, for those who want to delve deeper into Poets and Prophets, the website is simply poetsprophets.net. And it is a global community that is based in this little historic meeting house in Connecticut, where once we fought for our independence, now we are working toward our interdependence. So thank you. Latha, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for this very inspiring and rich and engaging session. I am very excited, and I hope that I'm able to attend one of your two-day retreats at some point that I've heard so much about. As Debbie mentioned, and Anita mentioned, New School obviously has a very rich history of operating in the progressive space, which I joke saying that this is the only secular, explicitly progressive baked into the mission school, because the other area that I find is that actually the Jesuit schools have social mission as part of their academic mission. So this is, so definitely an absolutely great fit for our school and our program. And we are working on developing a new graduate program, which is focused on inclusion, equity, and belongingness. And we are also working on developing an undergraduate program that's focused on sustainable development goals. Like, managing for what, leading for what is a very critical question that drives us. Because otherwise, the series came upon because my question was like, management and managers is seen as tools of oppression, but can they actually be drivers of progressive change? And can they actually be drivers and vehicles for social justice? And so our programs kind of reflect that underlying question. So I thank you so much for joining us. And our events are every month, first Thursdays and third Wednesdays. And we have 3 sets of events. One is a panel, which is a long-time practitioners. And one is an academic roundtable, which is like research roundtable, research papers on cutting edge topics from different vantage points. Since we also have persons, we have some people who do design and social justice aspects presenting their work. And the third one we have is like a workshop, and a lot of them, almost all of them, have to do with social justice tools and how do we actually build and design and redesign organizations that elevate this concern and also equip managers. Like, I think, one of the things is that we got to approach this from the perspective of giving the benefit of doubt that yes, organizations want to change, people want to change, and organizations, everybody wants to work at making things more inclusive, making things more equitable, making more things just. And so our next event is actually on August 19th. It's a Wednesday at noon. It's a research roundtable on leading for social justice. So it's looking at leading. So it's coming through from a research roundtable. So there are 3 researchers presenting their work on this. So I hope some of you will join us back. But keep looking up. We have 2 events every month, and we do want to kind of very ambitiously create a movement around management and social justice. So thank you so much for joining. And thank you, Anita and Debbie, again for an extraordinary session. It was really inspiring and amazing. Thank you.